Exciting. So we'll look at one of the passages today, or sets of passages, that the Septuagint can't go literal with. So it's like too strange in Hebrew to bring it straight across. So, all right. Well, welcome, and thank you for being here. So just kind of to remember where we're at, we've been going through Genesis 1 through 11, and we're looking at this set of stories that is offered as what all humanity holds together in common, right? So before you get to the story of Israel, you have a story about what all of humanity has, that they're kind of building their particular national cultural life off of, the same stuff underneath, so to speak, right? And so we've been going through that, and today we're reaching kind of this pivot point in the middle of this narrative, and it's, I think, probably one of the best known stories, both in the ancient world and in the modern world, that is in Scripture. And it's the story of the flood, okay? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing kind of compare contrast, but it's important just to notice that there are important similarities and differences between the account that we have in Genesis chapters 6 through 8 and other ancient narratives. And there's several ancient narratives of the flood, okay? And so the kind of the most famous one is the Enuma Elish, that in which, when Gilgamesh tries to find a way to achieve immortality, he makes this journey and meets eventually Utnapishtim, who is kind of the equivalent to Noah, who ends up being made immortal after kind of escaping the flood and leading his family and some helmsmen and, you know, some animals and kind of the core of their culture to the other side. And then there's also the Atrahasis epic, and then of course it's kind of spread about, but there's a Greek version in the story of the Phkalion, and so it's in Hesed, it's in Pindar, and it's in Lucian, Lucianos, right? So, and I'll just point out some similarities and some differences in broad strokes. I don't want to go into the details because it'll take too much time, but we can return to it if you guys want to. The similarities are you have God or the gods. They're not equivalent, but nonetheless, they play the same kind of analogous roles in the story, decide to wipe out humanity. There's one person who is tipped off in some way, who then builds this seaworthy vessel, an ark, brings his family, brings animals in, and then through that survives and comes out the other side of this great cataclysm. Now, that's kind of the similarities. Right? The differences, you could kind of wrap up in a few ways. The picture of God is quite different. Of course, in this account that we have in the Bible, it's part of this monotheistic revolution, right? So in the other accounts, you have multiple gods. They're very capricious. Because they're kind of personified natural forces, and nature's capricious, right? And so they're conflicted with each other, but there's this decision to flood the earth in order to exterminate humanity. The reasons behind it, and most of them are kind of vague, but in one of them, it's clear it's just because human beings are too noisy and the gods can't sleep adequately with human beings down there making all that noise, right? So you get this very kind of amoral kind of picture in the one. And then the reasons So you get kind of the nature of God versus the gods. The gods, when they release the flood, are then kind of frightened by it. They're crouching in fear, trying to get out of the way. It's clear that it's dangerous to them as well. Whereas God, in the biblical account, he's in complete control from beginning to end, right? Second, his way of making decisions is completely different. The gods are just doing this, because it's noisy, kind of sick of these beings, let's just stamp them out. In our account, we're going to see there's very particular moral reasons for kind of what God's doing here. There's something wrong in humanity that this is... I just put it this way. It's a failed attempt to remedy, okay? And we'll wait and see if that's correct, but I think that's the right way to say that. And so important similarities, important differences. Now, and like I said, there's more details, but we can loop back to them if you want to, if anybody wants to. But what I want to do, because we're doing this as part of kind of tracing this picture of what goes into the makeup of humanity, right? I want us to focus on something, on another line going through this. And so I'm going to start by planting a seed here on the front end. Just a question I want to kind of start stirring in the back of our minds, and we'll pick it up again at the end. And here's the question, or an observation. Creation stories in the ancient world usually are war stories. Okay, you have gods in conflict, and then out of the aftermath of a battle, you have a world that emerges. And so there's this kind of myth of creative violence that you get in a lot of these very, very early accounts. And it turns out that in our world, end of history stories often have that feature as well. Okay, there's this kind of epic, world-encompassing battle that's imagined, and then a new world emerges out of the wreckage of that disaster, right? So there's something deep in the human imagination that sees kind of total disaster scenarios, often with violence as the source of them, right? As a seedbed out of which you could finally get to the world that you've been aiming at, okay? Now, what I want to do is just kind of, having said that, I want to ask, what's that about in the human consciousness? And then notice something here, okay? The flood here is one of those kind of big resets, right? You get this epic cataclysm, end of a world, but we're given this story here at the very, very beginning, okay? This isn't, at the end of the Bible, this is at the front end. Right? Not only is it something that's part of the beginnings, it's also something that then we're told very explicitly in the story that it doesn't work, okay? It's a failed attempt, and that's explicit. Let me just kind of point this out real fast. So chapter 6 on the front end, we'll look into these passages a little bit more closely in a moment, but chapter 6, verse 5, so the Lord saw that the wickedness of man, of Adam, was great on the earth, that every inclination of the plans of his heart or calculations of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man in his image, and he had pain in his heart over it. And so he says, I'm going to blot him out. Okay, this man I've created from the face of the earth. So that leads to, everything that happens with the flood. And then as soon as the flood's over, so chapter 8, verses 20, 21, Noah comes out, he does a sacrifice. Verse 21, the Lord smells the soothing aroma, and he says to himself, never again will I curse the ground on account of man. And then notice this, even though the inclination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Okay? So the situation kind of that the flood is brought to remedy is there immediately after you come out of the ark on the other side. And so nothing at that level has changed. It's failed. Okay? As far as altering humanity at the place where it matters, it's failed. Okay? So the question I'm just kind of planting, and we'll loop back to, is why are we told that? Okay? What are we supposed to learn? Is this going to, how could this reshape, why would it be important for this to reshape the human imagination in some way? That part of us that expects that for the world to be the way it needs to be, an old one has to be torn down. Okay? Well, let's walk through the story, and when we come to the end, maybe we'll have some thoughts about that. Okay? We'll start by recalling the context. So as we kind of traced it in the sessions leading up to this, in chapter 5, in the very beginning of 6, what you see is this sense that humans are suddenly hyper aware that death is inevitable. There's no way out, right? We saw that in the genealogy, and I won't kind of repeat all of that, but it's clear there that there's this moment when suddenly within this period of time, you have people beginning to die just of natural causes. They're not killed. They just kind of, run out of steam and die. And that realization that death is not optional for any human being, like no matter what, it hits everyone, it kind of shakes people loose morally, right? And they begin to do some things that are rather kind of monstrous, Now, I want to dive into kind of the wrongdoing there, because we get a bit of a psychology behind it that drills in a little deeper in this passage here in chapter 6. And it also appears that it's one of kind of two options for responding to mortality. So I want to talk about kind of the emergence of man the planner, so to speak. Okay, on the one hand, and then we'll do a little comparison with the one who walks with God, or maybe we should even translate that. We'll talk about this in a moment, but who strolls with God. Okay, who strolls with God. So, chapter 6, verse 5. So this is after we have this account of the sons of God taking the daughters of men and producing these giants and kind of producing a name for themselves, right? And we have this passage that I read a moment ago, that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was spreading on, was great on the earth, and that every bent, every shape or inclination, right, of the plans of his heart was only evil continuously. Let me suggest that it's not an accident that this focus on humanity as planners emerges at this point. Okay, at this kind of follows this sudden awareness that death is coming. Okay, if you just ponder for a second what is kind of implied, what gives rise to planning or calculating, and the term here, you could translate it calculating. Also, it has a sense of kind of assessing and kind of doing the math behind something, so to speak, right? And so planning, it doesn't just require a future. Experientially, it kind of requires a foreshortened future, if I can put it that way, right? And so many of us have this experience of like can't get anything done without a deadline, right? You kind of have to have this sense of things pushing in order to produce. Well, the relation to the future that we experience shifts when we know that death is approaching, but very specifically approaching, but not utterly imminent, not impending, not going to happen like in a minute or two, right? There's this kind of, it's the middle space where I know there's an end and it's somewhat in sight, but it's not right here. And that middle space is where I find planning to be a natural thing to do, right? If I've got all the time in the world, no plans, right? If something's happening in a second, no plans, right? No chance, right? But it's that middle space that we find ourselves trying to calculate and organize how to make use of what time we imagine we have, right? So when this shocking prospect of death that none of us can get away from suddenly dawns on humanity here, okay, which is what chapter 5 is all about, then the calculating kicks in. And the way I think of it here is that the way that it's not just that there's an inclination to plan. It's kind of totalizing. It's every inclination of the plans of their heart are only wicked all the time. There's this kind of totalizing that takes place. It's not just that people begin to calculate kind of what they're going to do with their time, how they're going to use the world around them, but that becomes kind of all an obsession, kind of all-encompassing, right? And so the way I imagine this is that with kind of death on the horizon now, the question that starts to come to people's minds is, what will I do and how will I make use of the world around me that'll make this life worthwhile, right? That'll justify the pain that I'm going through here, right? That will, produce something impressive enough that people will remember it in years to come. They'll make a name for myself, right? That's what we saw. They're men of name, right? This generation. And so the problem here is it's not just calculation planning, because that's actually, that's part of the image of God in us. That's part of being made for dominion, made to kind of have a say over how things go in the world, right? So it's not that, it's rather the fact that it becomes this obsessive thing. And now everything is kind of a feature that everything in the world is something I would make use of for the sake of something else. Because what that means is that nothing is sacred. In a very important sense, part of what makes something sacred in this kind of Hebraic mindset is that it's not to be used for the sake of something else. That's kind of the essence of being sacred, right? So if the Sabbath is sacred, you don't use it for something else, right? If there's a space that's sacred, you don't carry things through it as a shortcut. Right? You don't just use it for the sake of something else. It's valuable for its own sake, right? It's there for its own sake, right? And so what happens at this point is that the whole world, and that very explicitly here includes other animals, other forms of life, and human beings, okay, and their bodies, They're just raw material now for me to make my name, to build my monument, to do something impressive, right? And that's where you end up with this generation that, with the face of death ahead, they try to, their strategy is trophy wives and epic battles and calling down dark powers, right? This is in the reading of the ancient world. This is where sorcery and things like that start entering in. And the focus in this chapter, very specifically, is bloodshed, right? It's and it's a bloodshed that then corrupts the earth. It corrupts the earth. So verses 11 and 12. Now the earth was corrupted in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence or bloodshed, Hamas, right? And God looked at the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And so then God says, well, I'm going to corrupt humanity upon the earth. He'll bring that destruction back. Okay? So the picture you get here is that when absolutely everything is bent towards selfish ends, nothing is sacred, then bloodshed, all of that follows. And so God is going to have to intervene. And what he's going to do on the far side of this is he's going to give the first set of instructions, okay? So that's chapter 9. We won't get to it tonight, but I'll just kind of foreshadow a little bit. And it's instructions that give the basis for what would become a civil society, right? And the one thing, there's just one thing at the heart of all of it, and that is there has to be a respect for life. Like even animals, you don't cut off a piece and eat it while they're still alive, right? And there has to be limits. You don't drink the blood. And then, so respect for all life, all biological life. And second, an absolute sanctity for human life, okay? And so that's going to be to come, right? But it says something about what's going wrong here, okay? All right, so on the one hand, we have this kind of turn to everything's just raw material that I calculate. Anything in my grasp is there to kind of make a name for myself, to do something impressive. And the result of that, if unrestrained, is even violence, right? Is what follows. But you get this kind of alternate figure here. In verse 8 of chapter 6, after God's decided to blot out everything, because he's already made them. Verse 8, but Noah, he finds favor in the eyes of the Lord, and we're told these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Okay. Now, let me suggest that there's a contrast here. So obviously this is a contrast with the kind of calculation that ends in a lot of bloodshed, right? That's a pretty obvious contrast. But there's also here a contrast with some deeper things that we've met earlier in these narratives. That there's a new form of relating to God that is emerging here, actually with Enoch, but with Enoch and Noah. Okay, and so the contrast isn't just with this kind of hyper planning, hyper calculating, but it's also with Cain and Seth. Okay, so you remember, you go back to chapter 4. And you get two new things that come from these two lines. With Cain, it's sacrifice, and with Seth, Enosh, it's prayer, calling on the name of the Lord. And in both cases, there's this sense, I think, that, if I do this, maybe I get that, right? So I interact with God. Maybe I give him a sacrifice. He makes my land grow. Or on the other side, I pray this prayer. God does this, right? So both are at least potentially instrumental, right? Do this to get that. But there's something else that's happening here in this idea of this image of walking with God. And in this, so it's the term that's used here, it's just the simple word halak for walking, but it's in the hithpael, which is reflexive, which means that it's an action done as it were for its own sake, right? So this is why I said you could translate it stroll with God. Something like stroll, you take a stroll, volta, right? The sense of it's a kind of a walk that's for the sake of walking. It's not just locomotion. It's not that, I'm going from point A to point B and the walking's just a way of getting there, and I could just as easily, ride a bike or run or, take a bus or whatever, because the point is to get from point A to point B. Instead, it depicts something where it's like one of the simplest activities of life, just the walk, right, is done with God for its own sake. Okay? For its own sake. So let's just kind of ponder that for a moment. It seems to imply a kind of non-calculating way of interacting with God in one's everyday life. Right? Maybe something like this. If you think the tendency would be, go back and you think of what's going on with Cain, remember that name that means control and so forth, is how can I use this higher power? How can I use God to improve my everyday life? And so I try to make God useful for this, right? And it's almost like there's a flip that takes place here, in which with Enoch and then with Noah, and then this is what Abraham gets invited to in chapter 17, kind of looking forward, is something like this, that if the walk with God is a walk for its own sake, then it'd be something like the things I do in my everyday life, right? The business of going and coming, of, making food and eating, of interacting with the people, all of that becomes, as it were, a fit occasion for an interaction with God that's there for its own sake, right? There's this kind of flip in what's being used for what, right? And so it's, as it were, about the journey, not about just getting somewhere in this case. And if Abram, who's called to do this, and then you get a whole lot of life narrative, if that's any indication of what this kind of stroll with God might look like, then it would have to do with being with God as you do things like, keep flocks, welcome strangers into your tent, buy fields, bury your dead, negotiate with neighbors, find a wife for your child, right? Make family, all of this, right? It's the humdrum, right? It's the stuff of living, but that becomes kind of when done with God, it's its own end, right? And that offers this kind of a different pathway here to kind of man the hyper-planner, okay? Now, moving in further into the story then, it's at this point that we're told that the bloodshed has corrupted the earth. God has pain in his heart when he sees it. As it were, God's own plans aren't sorting out. He had hoped humanity would be better than this, and humanity obviously isn't, right? And so he's gonna wipe this clean. Now, in chapter 6, verse 13, then, God speaks to Noah and he tells him to build an ark. And I won't go through the details of it, but just notice something here. Noah, up until the very last thing, of chapter 8, he does nothing except what he's told, as it were, right? You find out that he's walking with God, but he has this he just does what he's told, okay, over and over at this stage, right? It doesn't stay there, but that's where it starts. And what God tells him here is to build an ark, and this ark, just to ask you to think about it this way, it's something like a microcosm of an inhabitable world, okay? So when God makes the world, back in Genesis 1, the picture that we're given there is of kind of, among other things, creating this space between the waters above and below where there could be dry land. And he kind of puts this hard dome there in order to keep the chaos above and the chaos below away. And there's this kind of zone where human life can take place, right? Well, all that's about to be kind of undone temporarily. This is what you get in the flood is kind of uncreation, right? He kind of pulls off the roof, everything comes down. But before he does that, he tells Noah to make a little kind of microcosm of that world. And it's interesting that it's kind of set up as if it's like a little temple box, okay? It's similar in kind of dimensions to what you're going to get with, tabernacle and temple, this kind of thing. And it has kind of 3 levels up in the same kind of picture that you get of the cosmos, has 3 layers in this kind of ancient Near Eastern picture. So it's as if it's this kind of shrunken down little bit of an inhabitable world that is kind of produced at God's instruction. And then he's going to bring into it a kind of a sampling of life, right? Along with his family. And they kind of contract human and animal life into this little microcosm. And then God closes the door, okay? Just seals them in. And I think are supposed to imagine a very kind of dark moment of just kind of waiting it out. And what happens is by this kind of contraction in, kind of squeezing all existence into a little temple box, right? That this gives them a way to survive the disaster, okay? And there's kind of a profound surrender that takes place in this moment. If you look at once God kind of opens up the gates and of the sky, and the waters come down, you get this picture in verse 18. Let me just point out one other thing. Within the dimensions, he's told to bring, to make this box. It has no rudder. It has no front, no back. Unlike the other stories that you get of the flood in the ancient Near East, there's no helmsman. There's no sailors brought in to navigate this thing. You enter the box, and you have no control of what happens once you're in there. You go in and you wait, right? And so in chapter 7, verse 18, the water rules, prevails, has mastery, overwhelms upon the earth. And the ark, it just goes about on the face of the water, right? There's no steering. You just kind of contract in, wait, okay? See what happens. That's it. And so it says over and over here that the water prevails and so forth. And then the end result, though, kind of in contrast. So you have this kind of microcosm of life that just kind of contracts in, as it were, surrenders. Like it's not trying to guide itself. It's not trying to exert itself on its own. It just kind of surrenders to the moment. And it's going to make it through. But then notice verse 23, chapter 7, verse 23. Well, I'll go up above. Let's start in verse 21. So all the flesh that moved on the earth, that crawled on the earth, perished, birds and cattle and beasts, every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. All of that was on the dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, died. Thus he blotted out all existence that was on the face of the land. From man to animals to creeping things, birds of the sky, they're all blotted out. Only Noah was left together with those that were with him in the ark. And again, we're told that the water prevailed. So the term that's used here, I translated this, all existence is blotted out. New American Standard, which I'm otherwise reading from here, has every living thing. But the term behind that, yakum, is it has this. It's related to standing up on one's own, right? And in that sense, it's very similar to this kind of Latin root of our word existence, which means to stand out, right? To like self-assert in a way, right? And the picture here is that everything that's self-asserting, gone. Okay, it doesn't make it through this this moment, and have this sense that there's a certain wisdom in the midst of the most dire straits sometimes. Okay, to place a check on one's own plans and one's own attempts to control. Right? There's a time to unmoor and just let the waves take you. Okay? That's not every time, that's not all the time, but in some of these big moments where everything comes unraveled, that's the thing to do. You surrender, right? And it's kind of, you think about it this way: a small impact, you brace and it helps. With a really big impact, when you brace, you break, right? Kind of it's the irony of like the drunk driver, right? The one that's floppy is the one that survives with the big impact, right? But there's something to this. There's a moment in the worst situations, and knowing when that is that's its own problem, right? But where surrender is the only thing that actually brings one through. Okay, everything that stands up on its own goes, right? And so that yielding, maybe it's a moment in the walk with God, in the stroll with God. Now, again, I want to say it's a moment. It's not everything. It's important not to imagine that walking with God is a passive affair. Okay. Okay. And then chapter 8, verse 1 is where the story turns. So up to this point, you've had the kind of the waters prevailing, the flood getting worse and worse. Everything that stands up on its own gets stamped out, gets blotted out. But in verse 1, God remembers Noah, and he sets about, as it were, repairing the sky, and the flood stops, and the waters slowly begin to recede. And at this point, it's interesting, Noah starts engaging, right, in a new way. He opens the window, he starts sending out scouts, winged scouts, and then finally, he removes the covering and when God tells him, he leaves the ark. Okay, so if you kind of look at this with a broad enough angle, God tells him things to do, and he just kind of obeys, and he gets in the ark, and he contracts in, and he surrenders, and God shuts him into the ark. It's an important detail. He doesn't shut himself in. God shuts him in. But Noah has to exit on his own. Okay, he has to reemerge, and God tells him to, but he has to kind of push his own way out at that point. So there's this kind of back and forth between the things God does and the things that human beings are to do in this interaction. Now, at this point, having emerged from the ark, and God tells him, come out and, take out all the living things with you. And so Noah and all and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. This is chapter 8, verse 18. They come out. Every beast, every creeping thing, everything that moves on the earth went out. It's interesting. It says now by families. This is a little gesture forward because they go in by kinds and they come out by family. It's this kind of foreshadowing. We're going to move soon to nations and things like that. Okay, but anyhow, so they come out, and now in verse 20, Noah does the first thing with no instructions, no guidance of any sort. Okay, this is his first kind of unprompted, unguided action, and what he does. I don't know, you think, what are you going to do after basically, about a year in the ark? And by the way, this is, it's on New Year's Day, right? That he, the flood's over and they come out of the ark. And basically he barbecues some of his roommates, right? He's not told to sacrifice, but he thinks this would be a good thing to do, okay? And God's, just like Cain and Abel aren't told to sacrifice. It's their choice. And then there's upset about God's response. But sacrifice here again, it's a human idea. And when God looks at it, it doesn't seem like his estimation of this as a choice is very exalted, right? So chapter 8, verse 20. So Noah built an ark to the Lord, and he took of every clean animal, every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. By the way, in other ancient Near Eastern accounts, you have gods swarming around because they've been starving without having a sacrifice all these, this whole year. And so they're swarming around trying to get some of the blood from the sacrifice, okay? The Lord's not doing that here. He doesn't have any need for it. He smells this aroma, and the Lord says to himself, so this is the first thought that comes to the Lord when Noah, barbecues his roommates, is, I'll never again curse the ground on account of man, because the intent of the human heart is evil from youth. Okay? It's as if what he sees in this is that there's still something in this, I'm going to grab hold of this thing and just make use of it for the sake of something else, right? That leads to the bloodshed that's there in the generation of the, before of the flood. It's still there, right? There's something, even in Noah, the guy who walks with the Lord for its own sake, still has to kill something, right? There's something in humanity, right? There's something in us. And so God's realization here, as it were, is that humanity hasn't changed, not the deep stuff. And so at this point, let's kind of go back to the question that we started with, right? That I dropped at the beginning. what's the point of narrating a cataclysm to fix human wrongdoing and the corruption of the earth that brings, and then the second it's over, declaring that humans are unchanged? Okay? Some thoughts, okay? And after I give these, then we'll open it up and we'll see what y'all think. The first thing is that the root of the problem in human life, it's too deep for a disaster or a war or something like that to be an effective reboot, okay? As much as we imagine can happen with these massive, cataclysmic events, it doesn't get to the depths of the human makeup, which is a fundamental problem. Okay, it's a fundamental problem, and so I think part of this is to say, the problem is not the social structures that were there beforehand. Okay. It's not just if you can get to, the systemic social issues, not deep enough, okay? It's not just, as it were, biological pressure, a year without meat, this is middle of Sadikosti, so, maybe we have a little sympathy for Noah, but, it's not just biological pressure, right? It's not that there's a buildup of external practices in the world, and if you interrupt it all, then the world that we want will come out the other side. No, there's something intrinsic to the human psyche, the human heart, the way in which we instrumentalize the things around us that goes so deep that none of these kind of big external events can fundamentally change. So there's a certain futility to these hopes for kind of a big event that'll flatten one order with a thought that a better order will come out. Okay? The second thing I'm noticing here is that as God sees the depth of the problem in the human heart, the first thing he does is commit himself to working with the muddled, twisted people that we are. Right? So he says, never again will I destroy, as before, even though the heart is wicked in this way. So God, he basically at this point, he sets himself, I will accomplish my purpose in this world. I will build this world with people such as we are. Okay? And so that's a very important thing. It means that that God's interaction with humanity is not a perfectionistic all or nothing approach. Okay, he's fully aware that human beings can only manage so much, right? And he says, "We'll work with this." Okay, we'll work with this. Humans have a selfish bent. Okay. God knows it. He'll work with it. Okay. Now, at this point, it might be worth just kind of glancing back and noticing chapter 6, verse 3, before all this starts. I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but I'll just point it out again here. That the flood seems to, it's like a seam, it's a turning point in God's interactions with people. And he's kind of saying it here one way, like I'm going to work with them the way they are. But he says it in another way in chapter 6, verse 3, that says something about what his strategy's been up to this point, right? So he says here in 6:3, before the flood, he says, my spirit will not judge within Adam, within man, within humanity forever, because he also is flesh. His days will be 120 years, okay? And the way I take that is this, that language, it usually gets translated as abide with or something like that, or strive, but it's very specifically the word for judging, right? For like, that's moral evaluation, right? Making a call on something. He says, my spirit won't judge from within humanity any longer. What that's doing is it's kind of gesturing to what's the strategy in these kind of nearly 1,000-year lifespans that you get prior to the flood. I think the idea is, you know, he has this first stage where he says, okay, I formed humanity, I puffed into him some of my spirit when I made him a living soul. And then after that kind of, rebellion, this kind of decision to go with the life based on ambiguous understandings, right? The fruit of ambiguous understandings. God doesn't give any instruction. What you see up to this point is that God has kind of been very hands-off, and he's just let humanity, with some very long lifespans, not compared to other ancient Near Eastern king lists, but compared to us, very long lifespans. He just says, well, let's see what they can do. Right? And basically up to that point, he says, okay, end of experiment, not promising. You give them almost 1,000 years. They don't come up with anything good. And so the next stage is going to be, I'm going to limit lifespan, and I'm going to give external instruction. Okay? That external instruction we'll see arrive in the next chapter, in chapter 9. We'll do that at our next philosophy night. But what you see here is this kind of shift of strategy is God working with human beings such as we are. Okay, man the planner, man that can't get anything done without a deadline, but when he has that, is tempted to just kind of view the whole world as for the grabbing, make use of everything, nothing's sacred, right? And that can lead to these really dark things. He says, I can work with this one. We're gonna shorten up the life, and we're gonna give some extra instruction, and we'll walk this out. Okay. So, and then the final thing that you see here. So back to the end of chapter 8, is kind of this pledge for maintaining the natural order, right? Kind of natural time, we'd say. While the earth remains, seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, day, night. They won't cease, okay? And what that does is it provides just enough order for humanity to walk forward with some hope, okay? And so maybe with that in mind, right, knowing kind of God's insistence or kind of his determination, both that no big external event can fix the human issue, and he's committed to working with us such as we are, incrementally, bit by bit, not wipe it all out and make a better one, right? Maybe with that in mind, we can dispense with the illusion that tearing down this system, or whichever one we happen to be in at the moment, is the way to bring out one that'll work, right? Maybe we can take smaller steps with more chastened expectations. And if we do that, approaching the details of this life, the humdrum stuff, as an occasion in which we can interact with God and do that for its own sake, then he can get us maybe not to a perfect world, but to something good enough, okay? So let's stop there, or I'll stop there, and let's open it up for kind of questions, comments, process together.